I do want to talk about the other big developments in college football over the weekend. Of course, we got to talk about number one Texas falling to number three Ohio State. Now, I'm not going to overreact on here and say, "Oh my God, Arch Manning sucks. He was overrated. And Ohio State is clearly better than Texas, and Texas isn't going to make the college football playoff and all that." I'm not going to say that. Obviously, we do have a 12-team college football playoff now as opposed to a 4-team or even a 6-team CFP. I again think 12 teams is too much. Think about what it would mean to both these teams if Texas did lose this game under the 14 format. Then there would be a real conversation of could Texas even get into the college football playoff? They only scored 7 points and it was in the fourth quarter, and Ohio State was up 14-0. And Julian Satin, Ohio State's new quarterback, who the last name is Sayin, but when you say it right, Julian Sayin, it sounds like Satan a little bit, depending on the way you say it. But he played okay, but mostly Texas did not throw the football down the field. And you could tell with the talent they lost, including Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden on the outside to the NFL, and with Arch Manning just being faced by Matt Patricia, the new defensive coordinator at Ohio State's defense, changing up the looks, it just was not a good Texas offense from the get go. They could not move the line of scrimmage. Ohio State was better at both the offensive line and defensive line positions, and that's what won them this game. I did say, I know Arch Manning is a generational prospect, but I've heard the term generational prospect before in my life with three other quarterback prospects. Andrew Luck obviously did his thing with the Colts after Stanford. Unfortunately, Ryan Grinson, the former general manager there, did not believe in investing in offensive line. We know what happened. I've heard about Trevor Lawrence when he was at Clemson and how much better he was than Deshaun Watson, who Dabo Sweeney called Michael Jordan, and Lawrence is going to change the franchise. And he got drafted by the Jaguars, and he had that terrible first year with Urban Meyer. Bounced back really nice for a year and a half with Doug Peterson, and ever since has basically jumped off a cliff. And now we see if he can turn his career around with Liam Cohen. And then Caleb Williams, who his junior year, or excuse me, his sophomore year tape was better than his junior year tape when he was with Lincoln Riley at USC. Struggled year one with Matt Eberflus, Shane Waldron, and that Bears coaching staff, but they reportedly did not coach him. And we're about to see if Ben Johnson can fix Caleb Williams. So I've heard this with Arch Manning, right? He's a Manning. He's uncle is Peyton. His uncle is Eli, and he's Arch. And here we go. And I said, folks, last year when Quinn Ewers got hurt, and reminder now, Quinn Ewers, who if he came out the year prior was going to be a first round pick in the draft, goes back to college, and we've seen this with guys like Matt Barkley. Remember back in the day at USC 2012 draft, he was going to be the number three overall pick by the Browns if he came out, stayed in school, hurt his shoulder, and 2013 he was drafted in the fourth round by my Philadelphia Eagles. We've heard the same thing about Sam Bradford and Colt McCoy, right? Two great quarterbacks in 2009, 2010. Bradford hurts his shoulder, still the number one overall pick by the Rams in 2010, but never great. Colt McCoy goes from a generational prospect to a third round pick by the Browns, where careers go to die. What I'm saying is this: Quinn Ewers got the starting job back last year after he got hurt. Arch Manning came in, played 2 games, played okay, played decently, but they never went back to Arch Manning, and Quinn Ewers struggled down the stretch, especially in that college football playoff game against Ohio State and even Arizona State. And the fact that Arch could not get his job back told me something about Arch. It just sort of felt like that he was moving along slower than Steve Sarkisian, who I always said I think he's smart. I think he's a good offensive mind. I think he's a little bit overrated as a college football coach. As a head coach, I think he's better as an OC than a head coach personally. Obviously, coached in the NFL with the Atlanta Falcons. He was with Nick Saban in Alabama, but he hasn't quite brought Texas back to the powerhouse that they should have been, in my opinion, under Sarkisian. And I was just a little bit worried about Arch first start on the road ever in his professional career, college, obviously, um, and he struggled. Now, again, I'm not going to say he's a bum, but I think we got to slow down in this generational prospect stuff. I do think Ohio State's really talented. I said I think it's really hard to go back to back. Brian Hartline replaces Chip Kelly as the OC. They bring in Matt Patricia as the DC, replacing Jim Knowles. Two new coordinators. You knew offensively, at least, it was going to take some time. Defenses are always ahead of the offenses early on in the season. I do think Ohio State's really good. Like, I think they're right there with Penn State, who I think with Drew Adler is absolutely loaded. I've said this year if James Franklin does not win the national championship, he never will. Ohio State certainly has a chance to go back to back. They're really good. They probably should have been rated number one in the country. There was questions, obviously, about Saban after they move off Will Howard, but their roster to me is just overall better than Texas, and you saw that on Saturday. Now, obviously, Miami, Florida defeated um, Notre Dame on Sunday night. You had Carson Beck, who I said I had questions about coming off what he did at Georgia. Is he going to return back to the same quarterback? That's an interesting conversation to watch. I really like LSU and their new quarterback, Nutzenberger, out of the transfer portal. They got a lot of good players. I think Brian Kelly, this is a year that he can make noise in the SEC as they obviously knocked off Clemson. I said I'm not the biggest fan of Klubnik. I don't trust Dabo Sweeney, who still refuses to use the transfer portal for the most part. Yes, he'll beat up on Belichick and crew. I don't view them as the number four best team in the country. Never have. I don't view them as a perennial national championship contender. But obviously, outside of Belichick and Ohio State, Texas, the big story was Alabama falling to Florida State. And there are people on ESPN's own network calling for ESPN to let Nick Saban out of his contract to go back to Alabama for them to fire Kalen DeVore, who was really good at Washington. But the Pac 12 back then is not what the SEC is. And I like DeVore. Again, I think he's a really good offensive mind. He obviously had Michael Penix there with him his last year in Washington. Remember that offense lit up college football that year. Remember that awesome Washington Oregon Pac 12 championship game between Bo Nix and Michael Penix. And I liked what he did with Jalen Milroe last year, though they were certainly a little bit disappointing for that Alabama fan base. I thought with Simon coming in this year, a revamped recruiting class on defense, Ryan Williams in year two in that system, who I think is the number two wide receiver overall in college football, right behind Jeremiah Smith. I thought Alabama was going to make noise. And Florida State, after that terrible season last year, shows that last year is not this year. They came out, I think, motivated to make a statement, and they outplayed Alabama in all three phases: offense, defense, special teams. Now, I did pick Alabama to make it to the national championship game this year to lose to Penn State last week on championship rings. And I think Alabama can still make the CFP. Again, I like Kalen DeVore. I like the pieces. I know their brand is not as good as Nick Saban, but I think week one is all an overreaction. I think Alabama's still a good program. Now, again, are they as good as LSU this year? I don't know. They may not be. Are they as good as Georgia? Probably not. Maybe we don't know about this Simon. Maybe he's not as good of a quarterback as I think. But all of these teams play cupcakes in week two. All of these teams are going to blow out their opponents. Texas is going to win by a lot. Ohio State's going to win by a lot. Bama's going to win by a lot. Georgia's going to win by a lot. Clemson's going to win by a lot, etc. But if one of those teams or multiple of them struggle in week two and going into week three, because I don't think we have another big game till I think it's LSU Florida in 2 weeks. Um, that's when we start to get concerned. But I'm not concerned yet about Alabama. I'm not here saying the SEC is dead. I do think to a certain extent the Big Ten has leveled the playing field. I think the Big Ten overall is better than the SEC now. I think they have better quarterback play, and I do think they have better coaches. But the SEC is not dead. The Big 12 is not making a comeback, folks. There are two super conferences in college football between the SEC and the Big Ten. I think with Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, Michigan, I think you give the edge right now to the Big Ten, but the SEC is certainly not. And that's my thoughts on week number one of college football. Like that clip from the Brandsworth podcast? If so, make sure you go down there and hit that subscribe button. while you're down there hitting the subscribe button, make sure to also hit the notification bell so you never miss another upload. And make sure you check out all the other clips from the Brandon's World podcast right here on YouTube.